Oh man, what a crazy recent couple of weeks, huh? And I'll tell you, I've been meaning to sit down for a while now and make a video sort of recounting all of these events because so many things have happened that are worth discussing. And yet each time I had sat down and prepared myself to make a video, something else would happen. And then yet another thing would happen, and then yet another thing, and so forth and so on. And it just kept going and going and going, and it was extraordinary to watch. I mean, we live in interesting times. There can be no doubt about it. Not only have there been bizarre, strange, unprecedented, momentous events going on in the United States, but there have also been quite a few crazy things happening in Ukraine as well. And I'd like to really just sit down and discuss all of these things and sort of give my thoughts on all of these matters and I guess make a few predictions as well, and also address questions that I've commonly been getting in relation to all these matters in the comments of previous videos. So, I mean, God, where do we begin? Well, first of all, I mean, you had a series of court decisions from the Supreme Court and from lower courts as well, essentially granting Trump the presidential immunity provisions that he wanted, and then later dismissing completely the classified documents case that had been brought against him on the grounds that the prosecutor in that case had been appointed unconstitutionally. And this basically opened the door for eventually throwing out all of the criminal charges that the progressive elite have come together to hit Trump with in order to discredit him and so forth and so on. So it does appear that Trump is eventually going to be able to get rid of and destroy and put away all of these charges. The only question is when it will happen. Will it happen before the election or after? Personally, my money is on after, but who knows? But that's a minor thing, really, in the grand scheme of things when we consider everything that's been happening. Because shortly after that, there was an assassination attempt on Donald Trump. My God, they actually tried to kill Donald Trump. They actually went there. Good grief. It was astonishing. It was absolutely astonishing. Trump just so happened to move his head by precisely the right amount at precisely the right time, and had the bullet changed its trajectory by even just an inch or so, it would have hit him in the head and that would have been the end of it. Instead, all that happened is that he got clipped in the ear. And to add further astonishing things onto this already astonishing sequence of events, immediately after getting shot, as Secret Service agents are swarming him, as chaos spreads throughout the whole rally that he's in Pennsylvania, the first thing Trump can think to say as he's being swarmed and as the Secret Service agents are attempting to usher him off stage is, "Let me get my shoes." And then after that, he has enough presence of mind to raise his fist in the air, allowing the most iconic photograph of this entire election cycle and possibly even the 21st century American history in the grand scheme of things to be taken. And I mean, basically, in the wake of it all, Trump just ended up looking like a Chad. He ended up looking absolutely awesome. Then there, of course, the bizarre circumstances surrounding the assassination attempt itself. First of all, the shooter was laying on a roof about 130 yards away from where Trump was speaking, and he had a direct line of sight to him. The Secret Service did not think to put anyone on that roof. It did not think to fly a drone over the area and keep watch over it. The potential assassin was just given a direct line of sight to shoot Trump if he just happened to wish to do so. Plus, Trump's campaign had, before that rally, been making repeated requests to the Secret Service to increase his level of protection, and these requests had been denied. It then turned out, we then learned, that although the Secret Service denied receiving such requests immediately after this was pointed out, it then shortly thereafter came out that the Secret Service was lying about that, and that in fact they did receive such requests. There were Democratic congressmen attempting to campaign earlier to have Trump's Secret Service protection removed completely. So many bizarre circumstances. Plus, the shooter had been observed by people in the rally and even by local police as early as about an hour before he actually began opening fire. In fact, Thomas Crooks, the shooter, had been pegged as a suspicious person about 15 minutes before Trump was set to speak, and yet, despite being in possession of this information, neither the Secret Service nor anyone else attempted to dissuade Trump from getting up there and speaking. Then we have the issue of how suspiciously long it took to crack into Thomas Crooks's phone. That took a bizarrely long time. And yet, despite this, no one appears to be able to find very much information about him at all. He's sort of described as a loner, was bullied, etc., etc. And for quite a while, there was very little information coming out about his political leanings, except for the fact that he registered Republican and donated to Act Blue. Now, given the fact that these things don't really cohere with one another, it's possible that Crooks had registered as a Republican merely to, cause chaos in Republican primaries. Also, more recently, in fact, I just learned about this today before recording this video, Crooks had a Gab account, and he had made a number of pro-Biden, pro-COVID lockdown posts using that account. So it seems fairly clear that he probably was a leftist of some kind. But be that as it may, it's all been very strange and very difficult to find any information on him. And he fits the bill, frankly, for the sort of person that the FBI and other U.S. security agencies have tended over the course of their rather ignominious history to cajole and persuade and manipulate into carrying out various terroristic or criminal acts, so that said agency behind the manipulation could then spring forward, stop the criminal, and present themselves as heroes. So basically, I don't know this for sure. Nobody knows it for sure. We don't quite have enough information out about it all yet. But this looks like there was some glowy people involved with what happened. And that makes it all the more astonishing that Trump was not hit. Again, I mean, the bullet was maybe a mere inch or two, less than 2 inches probably, from his head. It clipped his ear, and it's providential that he survived. I see no other way of describing it. So we have that. Then shortly after the assassination attempt, we have a very high-energy RNC that was a lot of fun and was, definitely interesting, and showed the Republican Party being at a maximal level of enthusiasm, totally united behind Trump. You even had Hulk Hogan speaking, for God's sake, getting up there, ripping his shirt, cutting a promo, even making references to Macho Man Randy Savage, which was hilarious, Ooh, yeah, Macho Man Randy Savage, yeah. I am the cream, and the cream always rises to the top, yeah. So, that was... Well, he didn't do that, but I wish he had gone all the way with that. He at least did the "ooh yeah" bit. Oh man, but this part of the video is going to be clipped now. Watch. But anyway, so that was a lot of fun. The Republicans, for a brief period, appeared invincible. They were on cloud nine. They were riding high. Everything was great. And then things get even more insane. There's a coup in the White House. Now, this coup, and I skipped mention of this and probably should have backed up and mentioned it earlier, but it makes more sense to mention it now. But there was a coup in the White House. Biden was essentially forced not to run, and the reason he was forced not to run is because of his horrible debate performance against Trump. Although I have to say, I watched the entire debate live when it happened, and I have to be honest, I didn't think Biden did all that badly. But the reason I think that is because I've been watching him rather closely since before he became president and then throughout his presidency. And so his mumbling, his stumbling, his inability to finish sentences and complete thoughts, that whole thing he has where he kind of loses his train of thought and then he pauses and goes, anyway, and then he resumes, sort of resetting himself. I've seen him do this since before the previous election. So I knew that he was like this. I knew that he very probably had dementia or some sort of degenerative brain disease, that he was declining cognitively and so forth. But the media for years had been gaslighting everybody about this, pretending that it wasn't happening, accusing everyone who pointed out obvious, clear, unmistakable evidence of this, of lying. And so nothing that happened in the debate was really surprising to me. What did surprise me was the reaction of the media, because all of a sudden these people freak out. Oh my God, Joe Biden is declining cognitively. Oh my God, he's old. Oh my God, acting as if they had just realized this. And of course, there's no plausible scenario where that's true. I mean, remember, Democratic staffers, other politicians, his aides, and many journalists had been interacting with Biden on a fairly regular basis throughout his presidency. There's no possible way in hell that they did not see any of this coming. And so when they behave as if this was a bolt from the blue and totally surprised them, they're all lying. They're all absolutely lying about this. It's just that they're unable to hide it now. But given that they're lying about it, this raises another bizarre possibility, because frankly, as I watched this all unfold, it was difficult for me to think of a way to rationally account for what was going on, because I thought to myself, well, they know what's going on with Biden. They know that he's declining cognitively. Why on earth did they allow him to go into the debate in the first place? It was totally predictable that what happened would happen. And so there's a part of me that is suspicious that Biden was thrown to the lions on purpose so that the Democratic establishment could then have a reason to remove him from candidacy and force their other preferred candidate on the rest of us. And that, of course, is what turned out to happen. And now that Biden had been thrown out, and by the way, I describe it as a coup, and I will just say very quickly that anyone who does not believe that this was a coup, I have but one thing to say to such people. If you don't think this was a coup, if you don't see that this was a coup, it's because you don't want to. It's because you've reached a point where you've just become impervious to reality. I mean, for God's sake, Biden was isolated in his home in Delaware as Nancy Pelosi, Chuck Schumer, and other top Democrats were essentially working on him, trying to cajole him into dropping out. This was done basically in a way reminiscent of the last days of the Soviet Union, where Gorbachev was isolated in his dacha in Crimea. It went almost exactly like that. So top Democrats were pressuring Biden, and by the way, a mere 2 weeks before Biden made his decision to drop out, he was saying to everyone up and down, left and right, oh no, I'll never drop out, I'm fine, yes, I had a bad night, but it's okay, I can beat Trump, I'm never dropping out, I'm never doing it, there's no way, the only way I'll do it is if somebody shows me a poll that I would lose to Trump, and there's no poll that says that, etc., etc., etc. Just super confident, pressing on, and then bang, he's out of there. And he's out of there in a very bizarre way, because it's not as if he appeared on camera and explained directly and clearly to the public why he was no longer seeking a candidacy or no longer seeking re-election. It's just that some letter appeared on his Twitter account that an intern probably posted. So speculation has been running rampant about this, to the effect that Biden very stubbornly did not want to drop out, and the Democrats were only able to force him to do this by twisting his arm. There is a story to the effect that Nancy Pelosi essentially went to Biden at one point and said to him, look, Joe, we can either do this the easy way or we can do this the hard way. Now, I assume, because it's reasonable to surmise this, that the easy way probably consists in Joe Biden or his family, his son, his wife, his brother, and so on, being given some kind of sinecures and paid very handsomely for them. So he was promised, I would assume, that his family members would get jobs, they'd be paid a lot of money, and they'd do basically nothing, thereby ensuring that the family would be taken care of after he left office. That's probably what the easy way was. We can only speculate as to what the hard way might have been. It might have involved invoking the 25th Amendment. It might have involved something even more extreme. But I don't believe this nonsense that Biden stepped down out of patriotism and love for his country and all this other bullshit. He stepped down because the donors forced him to, and possibly because this had been planned long in advance. Yeah, but it's hilarious to observe the blatant astroturfing that's been going on from the media after Biden had been forced to step down. suddenly saying, "Oh, he's such a patriot and such a great man," and all this, and all of the NPCs typically they read all this nonsense and they believe it, and they completely ignore the fact, if they knew it at all, that the truth of Biden's political career is quite different. Joe Biden is a man who's had an extremely long, 5 decade long political career that consisted of an astonishing, embarrassing, extraordinary, mind boggling, unbelievable amount of mendacity and stupidity. Many people don't remember this, but in 1988, Biden actually ran for president, and he had to drop out of the race. And do you know why he had to drop out of the race? He had to drop out of the race because he plagiarized a speech. He plagiarized a speech from, of all places, from a British politician. And the press at the time excoriated him for this. And this is a habit that Biden has had, of just lying completely unnecessarily, telling absurd, ridiculous stories for no reason. And he's done this even into his old age, pretending as if, or acting as if, the internet doesn't exist and that he can't be exposed for this. So this is a man who just sort of gratuitously lies. And this has been an aspect of his character going back decades. And the personality traits that induce one to behave in that way are not personality traits that change. So it's just not the case that Biden is some kind of, heroic, decent man. That's all nonsense. But these are the narratives that we're being given. It was probably said to him, "Look, we'll take care of your family if you leave, and we'll praise you in the media, and if you don't agree to do this, we will force you out, and you'll have an extremely ignominious end to your political career." And that probably is what did it. But then things got even weirder, even crazier. For a while, there was speculation running around as to who it was that would replace Joe Biden. There were a number of problems with any replacement, mainly owing to the fact that unless Biden exited the race for health reasons and his replacement was his vice president, there would be a number of states for which the Democratic nominee, whoever it would then go on to be, simply wouldn't be eligible to run. They wouldn't be on the ballot and therefore would lose those states by default. There's also the problem that about $90 million in donations had been locked up because donors had gotten cold feet after seeing Biden's debate performance. So, yeah, what a mess. But eventually, after some speculation, after some rumors, they settled on Kamala Harris. And that was the next astonishing thing to me. Because I had sat there as this tumult and this fight, this palace intrigue was going on, wondering who would be chosen. And I, of course, thought, as I think most reasonable people would do, that the Democrats would make the politically savviest choice, which in their case would have been Michelle Obama, because she's the one who undoubtedly would have had the best chance of beating Trump. She's the one who has the most positive reputation among the public and would have maximized the Democrats' chances of victory. But they didn't do that. They didn't do that at all. As I say, they went with Kamala Harris, who of all Democratic candidates is the one that is easiest for Trump to beat, that will be easiest for Trump to beat. And it amazes me that they chose her. It genuinely amazes me that they actually went with this shape-shifting, reptilian sociopath. It's astonishing. But they did choose her. And now that they have chosen her, now that Harris has become the presumptive Democratic nominee, mainstream conservatives of all kinds have begun criticizing her and trying to paint her as if she were some sort of radical leftist. But this really isn't true. The truth is that Kamala Harris is a machine politician through and through, and that she has no guiding principles or guiding philosophy of any kind, and has never had any such thing throughout her political career. The only thing she has used in her compass to guide her behavior is basically this: where's the power? That's it. Just whichever way the wind is blowing is whichever way she will turn. Her beliefs, to the extent that she publicly expresses any, are entirely dictated by whatever the prevailing political winds happen to be. This is a woman with no genuine convictions. And one doesn't even have to go through her entire political career to see this. A small number of selections would be ample to illustrate this principle. First of all, Kamala Harris got her start in politics because she spread her legs for Willie Brown, the mayor of San Francisco. And after spreading her legs and getting down on her knees and all sorts of things, after doing all of that, she was appointed the DA of San Francisco. And after being appointed the DA of San Francisco, by the way, she managed to make a number of criminal cases and investigations that her predecessor had opened up against Willie Brown and against some of his associates for corruption and for other serious crimes suddenly disappear. Isn't that amazing? So this woman has an affair with the mayor of San Francisco. He puts his weight behind her, makes her the DA, and all of a sudden, all the criminal cases against the mayor disappear. How wonderful, how amazing, how extraordinary. But, things go further. Eventually, she rose to the post of California Attorney General. And by the way, there's another major scandal involving her that I should briefly mention. There was a pedophile scandal in the Archdiocese of San Francisco, and Harris's predecessor had put together a massive 800-page document detailing all of the ins and outs and all of the sordid details of this whole scandal. And upon rising to her post, Harris made this document disappear. She shut down the whole investigation, and that was that. So she swept up for pedophiles too. But later, upon becoming California Attorney General, she actually, in a number of cases, intervened to prevent exculpatory information from being brought to the attention of the courts that would remove people who had been wrongfully convicted of offenses and take them off of death row. She prevented this from happening. These were people who were wrongfully convicted because of prosecutorial misconduct. Exculpatory evidence emerged, and she blocked it from reaching the courts. Thankfully, in a number of such cases, she was ultimately forced to bow out and kind of not do this. But this shows you the extraordinary level of corruption of this woman, the extraordinary kind of self-seeking Machiavellian behavior that she displays. So she's not some sort of radical leftist. She's not someone with any real convictions of any kind. The only thing she believes in is her own power. This is a soulless reptile and nothing more. Yeah. I mean, this is who they've chosen. And besides these qualities, what else does she have going for her? Well, her qualifications include being black and being a woman. So basically, she represents the victory of the machine. She represents the victory of left-wing identity politics to infinity. And we can predict very easily from that fact what it would mean for the United States if she should become the president. Oh boy, what a mess! It all reminds one of something out of the late Roman Empire. I mean, some hilariously corrupt, comically incompetent person just completely selected as the result of a coup with no genuine democratic procedure whatsoever. I mean, they're not even pretending to care about the things that they profess to care about. I mean, obviously, for a long time, as members of the left have prattled on about the importance of preserving democracy, obviously there's been an unmistakable air of protesting too much surrounding all of that. I mean, the people who scream the loudest about the importance of preserving democracy are, in fact, the people who are the biggest threats to it, who are the biggest authoritarians. And this is fairly clear. Statements like "we must preserve our democracy" are obviously examples of what James Burnham called political formulas. And a political formula is basically a word or a phrase whose purpose is to give an acceptable sounding gloss to what really, to something that really just serves the naked power interests of the ruling class. And in every political formula, there is a formal, ostensible meaning and then a real meaning. The formal meaning of the political formula, "we must preserve our democracy," obviously is just what it sounds like it is. But its real meaning is this: the left wing, the center-left managerial class that currently rules America must be allowed to continue ruling America absolutely unopposed. That's what it means when they say we must preserve our democracy. Okay? Of course, if you understand this, you see very clearly that when the left wins an election, that's called democracy, and when the right wins an election, that's called fascism. This is kind of empty political rhetoric. I trust everyone listening to this understands this. But my God, they actually chose Kamala Harris, and good God in heaven, what horrible things that portends. Because in addition to being a soulless reptile, as I said, she's also, she's got all of the qualities of Hillary Clinton, pretty much. There's really no one else in American politics who compares to her quite as well or quite as accurately as Hillary Clinton does. She's got the same narcissism, the same entitlement, the same ruthless, throat-slitting ambition, the same willingness to do absolutely anything for power. There is, however, one salient difference between Hillary Clinton and Kamala Harris, and it is this. Unlike Hillary Clinton, Kamala Harris is just really, really, really dumb. Really stupid. If you've listened to her speak for more than 10 minutes at a time, first of all, before anything, you have my sympathy. But in addition to that, if you've listened to her speak for any significant length of time, you know immediately that she sounds like a really stupid person who's desperately scrambling to sound smart, desperately scrambling to mimic the diction and the speaking patterns and the mannerisms of an intelligent person, or what she imagines that an intelligent person must be like. This is an idiot bullshitting his way through life and trying to sound smart. And this is who's been pushed ahead to be possibly the next president, simply on the grounds that she's black and a woman and slept with the mayor of San Francisco and knew throughout the course of her political career when to say yes, sir, and when to say no, sir, to the right people. This is a total machine politician, but this is what we're facing. And man, oh man, can you imagine how bad it would be if she wins? Like, we'd be screwed. There'd be no point anymore in paying attention to American politics. But, as I say, Trump survived an assassination attempt, and the RNC went off very well. So this then brings me to the question that I've been building to here. Who do I think will win? Well, up to this point, I've been asked this question many times, and my answer always has been that Biden would win the election, simply because I had watched what happened during the 2020 election, and I saw how massively, overwhelmingly, ridiculously, and absurdly fortified it had been. And if they fortified that election, of course they're going to fortify this one as well. And so that just sort of gave me the confidence to kind of ignore the polls, ignore even day-to-day political events. Who cares about any of this? We live in a decaying, corrupt, late-stage empire where the ruling class does whatever it wants and the media carries water for the ruling class. The purpose of the mainstream media, after all, is to insulate and protect the ruling class from criticism. So my firm prediction for a while had been that Biden would win, but of course now Biden has dropped out, and Biden has been replaced by a violently, viciously, viscerally unlikable person. Someone who is singularly lacking in charisma. Someone whose only salient personality trait appears to be her inability to prevent herself from giggling at inappropriate moments. And to the extent that Harris is, at the moment that I record this, experiencing a bump in her polls, I'm quite sure that this is temporary, because people have simply forgotten how annoying and unlikable she is. The worst thing she could do is expose herself to the public. Now, of course, there'll be an enormous number of id poll voters who will just blindly go and vote for her on the basis of her identity characteristics, and then there will be those people who simply vote for her because they wish to vote against Trump and they have incurable Trump derangement syndrome and have been brainwashed by the media to believe lies. And there are millions of such people, and we shouldn't underestimate that. But despite all the fortification measures that I expect to happen, I really have a hard time seeing her winning. Not that I say it's impossible. It certainly is possible, and we shouldn't discount that possibility. But I'm probably going to change my prediction at this point and say that I give Trump maybe a 70% chance of winning. I'm not as confident as people like Sticks are, who essentially give him a 99% chance, for the simple reason that there's going to be a whole hell of a lot of fortification, and a lot of that fortification is computerized. Remember, the fortification machines can be connected to the internet, and if that's done, then fortification becomes basically child's play. Now, the election will come down to a few swing states. And so, if you're an American listening to this and you live in any of those swing states, places like Wisconsin, Arizona, Georgia, Michigan, and so on, Pennsylvania, etc., if you live in any of these places, bring your phone with you. Bring your phone with you and be prepared to document absolutely everything, because I promise you all right now, there are going to be magical vote dumps at 4 in the morning. There are going to be election workers pulling briefcases out from under tables, and all the other things that we've seen previously. All the other wonderful, magical, mystical, amazing fortification measures are going to reappear, and we may even see some new ones. But I'm going to tentatively predict, and again, I don't say this with much confidence, but I'm going to tentatively predict that Trump will win the election. The thing that ultimately persuaded me to change my view to that was not the horrendous unlikability of Kamala Harris. It was not the assassination attempt and the fact that Trump looked like a Chad. It wasn't any of those things. It was Elon Musk's announcement that he planned to donate a sum of $45 million to a Trump-affiliated super PAC every month between now and the election. And the purpose of that super PAC was to basically improve Republicans' ground game in the area of mail-in voting. So encouraging early registration, encouraging mail-in voting, encouraging all of this. Now that does have some impact upon fortification, but it doesn't directly address the issue of computerized fortification. But I, of course, surmised here that, well, maybe the stated purpose of the super PAC doesn't describe what it's fully intended to do, and maybe at least some of those funds will therefore go to tackling these deeper issues. But then another bizarre thing ended up happening, which is that recently a reporter stopped Musk, or followed Musk as he was walking through the halls of Congress, and basically asked him whether it was true that he planned to donate $45 million per month to Trump, and Musk responded that this wasn't true and that the Wall Street Journal made up the story. So I have no idea what the hell is going on. I'm basically saying this: expect a lot of fortification. There's going to be a great deal of it. I encourage everyone living in a swing state to do everything they can to document this fortification, because it will take place. It's quite possible that there may even be fights that break out at polling stations as a result of this. But Kamala Harris is so horrendously unlikable that I don't see it. I mean, it's possible. I don't rule it out completely. But I think Trump will probably, by the skin of his teeth, manage to pull this off. That then pushes us into the next stage of the discussion. If Trump wins, what will it mean? Well, first, let's discuss what it will mean for the world if Harris should win. It's pretty simple. We all know what it means for America. Domestically, the agenda is pretty clear. Endless mestizos swarming into the country, endless non-white immigrants, diluting the demographic balance and altering it even more until eventually they reach the point where it's not possible for Republicans to win any elections on the federal level. That process will continue apace. The economy will decline. The culture will become more and more irrational. And, all the baleful tendencies that we can already observe in abundance will simply continue and accelerate. That's clear enough. On the question of Ukraine, what will happen if Harris wins? That's also fairly clear, and I'll mention that because I've made a number of videos on the subject of Ukraine, and I have an interest in that subject because of my own ethnic background. So I'll mention that very briefly. I think Harris will simply continue the Biden-era policy. That is, she will drip in weapons slowly to Ukraine and give the Ukrainians just enough weapons to be able to hold the Russians back, but not enough to make any major advances, and not really enough to achieve total victory and restore the Ukrainian borders of 1991. The result of this will be that both countries will slowly bleed out and there will be horrendous damage done to them both. And it will probably be doubtful whether either of them will be able to recover fully. And so, even if Ukraine wins, the victory that it would achieve under those circumstances would probably be a Pyrrhic one. Now, why is the Biden administration and a possible future Harris administration sending weapons so slowly to Ukraine? And to put it simply, it's because they don't really have any discernible plan beyond the idea that they should put some amount of pressure on Russia, but not too much. That is, some pressure, enough to make it uncomfortable, but not enough to destroy it. And that is true, that is the case, because the left in the United States doesn't really want to destroy Russia. The ruling class doesn't want to destroy Russia, and it doesn't want to destroy Russia for a very simple reason. Russia is useful to them. It is useful to have an enemy. It is useful to have someone to whom you can point and declare to be a threat so that you can then scare the domestic populace into rallying around you. After all, if Russia is destroyed, if Russia is split into 24 or so smaller countries, if the Russian Empire is broken apart and smashed into pieces, who will the Democrats be able to blame when elections don't go their way? So it's obviously in their interest to keep Russia in existence, even though they might also weaken it significantly. So that's basically what'll happen. It'll just be more inevitable decline domestically and more of a slow drip into Ukraine. There will be no pressure put upon the Ukrainian government to institute any kind of radical reforms, and so nothing much will change in Ukraine, and the future there will be pretty bleak as well, even if the Ukrainians do manage eventually in some form or fashion to achieve victory. So, moving on to Trump. What do I think will happen if Trump wins? Now, there's been a lot of triumphalism among Trump fans after the assassination attempt, but I think we need to slow down and be reasonable about this and do a rational accounting of what the real probabilities and likelihoods are. Trump isn't going to achieve very much even if he manages to win. Remember, the demographic situation is considerably worse now than it was even just 4 years ago. There's been millions of mestizos let into the country, and they don't vote for Republicans. Like pretty much every non-white group, they vote in overwhelming numbers for the left, and they do this tribalistically, which means that they will not be convinced, for the most part, will not be convinced to change their position, and any significant investment of resources to get them to do so will probably be wasted. The only major demographic group that doesn't vote totally tribalistically is white people, and this has been true for quite a while. So, but if Trump does manage to squeak by and win, what will happen? Well, in a word, I expect the economy to improve. I expect rates of immigration to drop somewhat. We may even see some deportations, although not nearly anything on the scale that would be necessary in order to really kind of save the country from its inevitable slide into decline. Trump would have to deport literally millions of people, and I don't see him doing this because, number one, I just don't think that he has the stomach to do something like that. I don't think he has the stomach for it. And secondly, I don't see the administrative agencies cooperating with him. Now, it's true that this second Trump campaign, particularly from people like J.D. Vance, has expressed some willingness to tackle the issue of the administrative state. And this is all important for any Trump presidency or anyone like Trump who has any hope or desire ever to take power in any form or fashion in the U.S. at any point in the future. Because while conservatives have criticized Biden for his cognitive decline quite often and have asked rhetorically, who's running the country? Of course, if you really understand how the U.S. government works, you understand that the president does not run the country. That's not what happens. That hasn't been how things have been since at least the progressive era, so about 100 years. The truth is that it's the federal bureaucracy that runs the country. It's the administrative agencies that run the country, and therefore it's perfectly acceptable to have a vegetable as a president, to have a laughing retard like Kamala Harris as president. This poses no problem because the president doesn't run the country. The president may make a few decisions here and there on the margins when the various factions within the bureaucracy or the other elements of the federal government can't agree with one another. But on the whole, he really doesn't make any major decisions, and it's utterly wrong to say that the president runs the country. That means, however, that if Trump is to change things in any way, if he's to make any significant reforms, the most important thing for him to do is to tackle the federal bureaucracy. In a word, he needs to fire people en masse. He needs to fire them by the hundreds, if not by the thousands, and then replace them with his own people. However, I don't think he has that many people. He doesn't have like a squadron of hundreds or thousands of people whom he can put into these administrative agencies and who will be loyal to him and will turn the machinery of government in the way that he wants it to turn, who will work with him instead of obstructing him. Since he doesn't have this many people whom he can trust to take over the federal bureaucracy, his only realistic choice would be to fire federal bureaucrats and to abolish the agencies that they work for, which would be a de facto libertarian approach. However, Trump is not a libertarian, and so he's not going to take that approach. What this means, in a word, is that any reforms to the administrative state that he manages to implement will be minor. He's not going to accomplish very much at all. Maybe a few things, but not too much. So like I said, what we can expect to see from Trump is maybe a little bit of reform of the federal bureaucracy. Maybe a few people will get fired if we're lucky. The economy will do better. There will be fewer immigrants coming in, and we'll get to laugh at Democrats for the next 4 years. But that's about it. That's realistically about it. And given that fact, given that it's probably too late to institute the reforms that are necessary, or that things have progressed so far and metastasized so far that to really push forward and implement the kinds of reforms that are necessary to save the United States from totally collapsing, one would have to do things that are completely beyond the pale and totally beyond the Overton window of today, and things which no one has the stomach or the willingness to do, and so they're not likely to be done. Given that fact, given the fact that the United States will probably in the next, perhaps 20 or 30 years, fracture inevitably, and even under the best circumstances will divide itself and break up, and you may then have a civil war and secession movements springing up. And again, this is under the best of circumstances. The worst of circumstances is just that the left-wing pause, continues unabated, and we sort of continue our slide down into more and more leftism, more and more degeneracy, more and more decline, more and more impoverishment, more and more class warfare, more and more irrationality, etc., etc. The best case scenario is that we'll see this kind of fracture of the country. But realistically, Trump is not going to be able to prevent this. He might slow it down somewhat. He may enable the right-wing portion of America that then secedes from the broader America to be in a slightly better position when the time finally comes for it to make a move towards secession. But that's about it. And given that fact, given that the West is in this almost, I'd say pretty much terminal period of decline, anyone who cares about the future of Western civilization should begin casting about for other ways to perpetuate and continue the Western idea in other places. And this is ultimately why I think the war in Ukraine should be of importance to people on the right. Trump supporters tend to look at the Ukrainian government as corrupt and, just basically kind of trashy and third worldish, which it certainly is. That perception is not an incorrect one. However, given that Ukraine is under immense pressure today, and that such pressure tends to be conducive to radical reforms, it is possible that at some point in the future, perhaps 50 or 100 years from now, that Ukraine may end up becoming a new center of Western civilization and may end up presenting possibilities for the Western idea to reemerge, for the West to reinvent itself. That's why the war in Ukraine is important. Okay? If the Russian Empire collapses, if Ukraine achieves total victory, if it's able to deal with its own corruption problems, it will have nothing short of a renaissance. And if this happens right as the current center of Western civilization in the United States is facing racial balkanization and decline in virtually all facets, this will be the best chance for the Western idea to continue. Now, I was planning in this video to give a sort of general discussion about the stages that civilizations pass through. And in doing this, I would be drawing upon Carroll Quigley's book, The Evolution of Civilizations, and the 7-stage model that he presents there. And I'm going to do that in a bit, but I want to slow down for now and pivot to Ukraine and discuss some of the news that have been coming out of Ukraine. Now, there is some bad news, there's some very bad news, and then there's also some very good news. And I'll start with the very good news. And I'm not really going to be talking about the situation on the front, because really that doesn't change very much, and there have been only kind of slight positional movements. And unless there's a radical change in the American policy with regard to supplying Ukraine with weapons, that doesn't seem likely to change. And I'll get to the prospects for that radical change in U.S. policy in a moment. But let me shift over now to Ukrainian news. And I'll start with the good news first. On July 17th, Roman Chervinsky, the Ukrainian counterintelligence officer who approximately a year and a half ago gave an interview to a group of Ukrainian journalists where he essentially accused the Zelensky government of treason and of disarming Ukraine and doing whatever it could do to make it as easy as possible for the Russian army to sweep into the country and take over large swaths of it without a fight. He then, gave various specifics like the demining of Chonhar, which is an area that connects Crimea to mainland Ukraine, which previously had been mined, thereby barring the passage of Russian troops from Crimea into mainland Ukraine. But someone high up in the Ukrainian government, and it isn't quite clear who, but someone high up there, gave the order that that area should be demined very shortly before the Russian invasion in February of 2022. He also pointed out Ivan Bakanov, who was Zelensky's head of the SBU, which is the Ukrainian intelligence service, and who was a personal friend of Zelensky himself. He pointed out that Bakanov had accepted bribes from Russian agents and in exchange allowed them to get jobs within the Ukrainian security services. So this is basically treasonous, and when this was exposed after the invasion, Zelensky's government then proceeded to allow Bakanov to go into hiding, and he's not been punished, and there's no visible prospect that he ever will be punished. So he pointed out these bits of information and others, and then immediately, the day after he gave this interview, he was immediately arrested. And he's been kept under pre-trial detention for about a year and a half now. But as I said, on July 17th, he was finally released. There was finally public pressure put on the government to let him out, which the government did very reluctantly. They agreed to allow him to post bail, and somebody paid his bail. It's not clear who, although there's speculation that it was Poroshenko that did it, which makes sense because he's about the only person in Ukraine who would have the money to pay a sum of bail, to pay bail like that, and who would also have an interest in doing so. But in any case, Chervinsky is out of prison. The government is now campaigning to keep him under house arrest and is also attempting to make up further charges, criminal charges, to hit him with. And we'll see how that goes. But at this point, he's out of prison, and that's wonderful news. It shows that the truth about what the Zelensky government was doing and what sorts of agreements it had made just prior to Russia's invasion, it seems that the truth of this is gradually coming out, and more of Ukrainian society is beginning to open itself up to the possibility that Zelensky's government is treasonous and that there had been a backroom deal made with Russia prior to the invasion. So that's the good news. Now, about the bad news, I'd like to discuss just a few instances of corruption in Ukraine, and it's a bit difficult to discuss this because there tends to be a lot of discussion in right wing circles about corruption in Ukraine, and some of the stories that you hear there are just blatant Russian propaganda. But then there are other stories which one will only have access to if one happens to speak Ukrainian and if one happens to know the language. And these stories just don't make it into any sort of English speaking media at all for obvious reasons. And I'd like to discuss a few of them. Now, I should preface this by saying that in no way can my discussion possibly be comprehensive because, frankly, there's a new corruption scandal that breaks out in Ukraine every week or so. It's embarrassing. It's disgusting. It's horrible. It pisses me off to hear this happening repeatedly, and it especially makes me angry to know that the Zelensky government is essentially doing nothing about the corruption problem. And that's not an exaggeration. The worst that has happened is that a handful of officials who have been embroiled in particularly egregious corruption scandals have been fired. But that's the worst, that's the most that's been done. As of right now, no one, absolutely no one, 0 people have been sent to jail. And there have been various excuses offered to try and explain this away by the government, to the effect that there's legal procedure that must be followed and so forth and so on. Although I will draw your attention to the fact that no one bothered to have scruples about legal procedure when Roman Chervinsky was arrested. No one bothered about that. But be that as it may. So let me just discuss a few recent corruption scandals. There is a member of the Ukrainian parliament and a member, no less, of Zelensky's party, Sluha Narodu, the servant of the people. Yeah, what an apt name. I swear they're really servicing the people. They really are. There's a member of Zelensky's party called Mykola Zadorozhny, an enormously, disgustingly Jabba the Hutt-like, extremely corpulent man who hails from the Sumy region and was recently made the head of a committee whose purpose it was to investigate corruption that relates to rebuilding and reconstruction in the Sumy region after Russian rocket attacks. So he was the head of this anti-corruption commission, specifically an anti-corruption commission related to reconstruction and rebuilding, and yet he turned out to accept bribes in relation to reconstruction and rebuilding. I mean, you can't make this up. You absolutely can't make this up. So he was recently arrested, and it's not clear whether he'll be charged with anything. The most that's been done so far is that Zelensky's party has formally rescinded his membership. But that's about it. Nothing has happened to him as yet, and it's not clear that anything will. I should also point out that there is a bill floating around the Ukrainian parliament right now, and this is astonishingly bizarre. I'm going to be doing a lot of face palming as I go through this because, God, I mean, you can't make this up. The bill that I'm referring to here, it hasn't yet been passed into law, although it has passed the first stage of voting that a bill must pass through in the Ukrainian parliamentary system before it can become law. And one of the provisions in this bill is that if you are a public official and you are accused of corruption, if you are accused of accepting bribes or stealing money, then if you return what you've stolen and you pay a fine, then you can automatically have all of the charges dropped against you. Now, I want you to think about this very clearly to see the absurdity of it. This bill is basically saying that if you're a public official who's been accused of participating in bribery, then if you pay a bribe to the government, you can have all the bribery charges against you dropped. That's insane. That's absurd. That's ridiculous. I mean, this is like African levels of third world bullshit. It's horrendous. But this is what's going on in Ukraine right now. Now, once again, as usually tends to be the case with such things, there was a public outcry over this bill, and a few of the parliament members who voted against it have now sworn up and down that on the second round of voting they will not vote for it, at least not without major amendments removing this provision. A few of them claim that they only voted for that bill without knowledge of what was in it. That's a lie. Of course it is. But this is what's going on. Corrupt members of the legislature, of the parliament, are trying to pass laws insulating themselves from corruption charges. It's absolutely insane. Moving on to the military, there was a general in the Ukrainian military, Yuri Sodol, who was known as a butcher, who was known for basically sending his men to death, sending them into impossible operations where they were almost certain to die, who essentially behaves like a Russian commander behaves. Prior to the Russian invasion, he was the commander of the Ukrainian Marine Forces, and this is a position that he retained for some time after the invasion. He was also responsible for the defense of Mariupol, and he completely botched it. He was, needless to say, not punished for this in any form or fashion. But then, after General Zaluzhny was thrown out and General Alexander Syrsky replaced him as the general head of the Ukrainian armed forces, Sodol was given command over the entire Eastern Front. And you'll notice that the Eastern Front is the area where Ukrainian soldiers complain the most, where they say that they are least adequately provided for, where the fighting is the hardest, where the casualties are the highest, where the command cares the least for their lives and is most willing to just throw them away frivolously. And, it's not surprising that a guy like Sodol would be in charge of this. Now, I mention him because there's been a recent scandal involving him. A few weeks ago, Bogdan Krutevich, who is a member of the Azov battalion and one of its most prominent members, and therefore a war hero with an unimpeachable reputation, finally had decided that he'd had enough, and he had written a telegram post excoriating Sodol, accusing him of corruption, accusing him of not caring about the lives of the men under his command, and sending them off on death marches, basically, sending them off to die, and also of accusing him of going off to basically get hammered with the mayor of Odessa, who himself has connections to the Russian government, right as the Russians were threatening to make, and in fact made, an important breakthrough on the Eastern Front. So all of this sort of stuff, accusing him of all this corruption, accusing him of things that frankly would warrant the death penalty in any decently run country. And after he had made these accusations, that again kicked off a public outcry, and that eventually prompted Zelensky finally to fire this man, despite the fact that soldiers had been complaining about him for years behind the scenes and no one had done anything. So finally he was fired. However, in Ukrainian law, when accusations of this type are made, it is required that a criminal investigation should be opened up, and the government should investigate whether the person accused is really guilty of what he has been accused of, whether the charges of any substance to them or not. This doesn't mean that Sodol should be arrested or jailed, but merely that an investigation should be opened into the matter concerning him. Now, this was not being done. The Ukrainian government was dragging its feet over this. And Krutevich, understandably angry over this, eventually decided to go to the court and appear there personally and attempt to force the issue. So he found the judge whose job it was to deal with the Sodol case and attempted to personally go there and force him to move the matter forward. When he did this, however, he found that the judge in charge of the case had mysteriously just then and there decided that he would go on vacation. So in response to this, Krutevich attempted to get the matter transferred to another judge, which he successfully did. But then, immediately upon his doing that, it was then found that that judge had decided all of a sudden that it was time for him to go on vacation. Now, obviously, things like this do not happen by accident. Obviously, this is an ass-covering measure. Obviously, there are factions within the government who are attempting to protect Sodal. And to be absolutely frank about this, either the Ukrainian government roots out these people and prevents them from protecting all of these corrupt officials, or Ukraine's own corruption and the propensity to theft of its own officials will eventually end up burying the country. Because every act of corruption like this only makes it easier for the Russian army to win, which is why I absolutely and utterly detest all of these ostensible Ukraine supporters who don't want to talk about corruption in the Ukrainian government and who insist and swear up and down that all accusations of corruption are just instances of Russian propaganda. They are not. They are very real, and it is necessary. It is essential. We have an obligation to tell the truth about these things and to be honest about them, because unless we are, there will be, first of all, no prospect of the Ukrainian government ever reforming itself. And if it doesn't reform itself, it will be crushed, like Ukraine will be destroyed. And if we persist in dishonesty about corruption, eventually the truth will come out anyway, and that will only alienate Ukraine from its own allies. So in no way does putting a lid on this serve Ukraine's genuine interests, and I will not participate in any form or fashion in doing this. If there is corruption, and there is certainly an enormous amount about it, I will make no attempt to hide it. I will always be honest about it. Another case, another just embarrassing, disgusting case that really just makes Ukraine look like a horrendous shithole country, if I'm being absolutely honest, involves former Chief Justice of the Ukrainian Supreme Court, Vsevolod Knyazev. In a word, he was discovered a few months ago to have hidden about $2.7 million, that is US dollars, worth of bribes in his couch. Now, there is an anti-corruption bureau in Ukraine whose task it is to pursue corrupt officials, to investigate them, and to arrest them. However, in the anti-corruption bureau, there are leakers. There are people, and this has been well known for quite a while, who basically work there and attempt to protect all corrupt officials from prosecution. And as the Bureau is building a case against such people and preparing to conduct a raid, these people leak information to the intended target of the raid and make it easier for the person to get away with whatever he's doing. Now, in the case of Knyazev, this thankfully did not work out. The plan to conduct a raid on his premises was kept secret well enough, and he was arrested. However, he's yet to be thrown in jail, and in the subsequent court hearings involving him, he has attempted to persuade the court to not force him to wear an ankle monitor. And there's a quite hilarious example from one of the court hearings dating back to May 24th, in which he basically says, well, come on, I don't need to wear an ankle monitor. What do you think I'm going to do? You think I'm going to try to flee the country? You think I'm going to try to swim across the river in western Ukraine and get into Hungary or Romania or one of these places? Don't be absurd. I have no intention of doing any such thing. But then, on July 10th, Knyazev is found attempting to do precisely that, attempting to flee across the western Ukrainian border. He was in fact caught, much like Gonzalo Lira was caught, and under much the same circumstances. The only difference being that in Lira's case, he was a narcissist who couldn't possibly allow any situation to stand where he had to take an L, and so he basically outed himself and live streamed his own escape, which is what allowed the Ukrainian government to catch him. In fact, what happened with Lira is that he was arrested, but then the Ukrainian government, the SBU, decided that he was really more trouble than he was worth, and so they sort of winked in his direction and said basically like, okay, look, just leave, just get out of the country, but stay quiet about it, don't talk about it, shut your mouth, and then after you leave, we'll just pretend like you escaped, even though they effectively allowed him to escape. But because Lira couldn't keep his mouth shut, the government was then forced to arrest him on the border. And this is more or less what happened with Knyazev as well, except that someone was able to tip off the SBU to his attempted escape. And so it seems clear that within organizations like the Anti-Corruption Bureau and the SBU, there are warring factions. There are those who genuinely are pro-Ukrainian and who want to punish corrupt officials, and then there are those who are pro-Russian and who seek to make it as easy as possible for these people to get away with their crimes. But that's the situation. You have a Supreme Court justice accused of taking bribes who was found with $2.7 million hidden in his couch, and recently he was arrested trying to flee the country. This is embarrassing. I mean, for the Americans listening, imagine if something like this happened involving John Roberts. How ridiculous would this look? This looks like just third world bullshit. It's an embarrassment. Now you might say, well, these people are being caught though, but they were caught. Yes, okay, sure, a few people have lost their jobs, but this only happened after immense public pressure. And again, I repeat, no one, absolutely no one involved in any of these numerous corruption scandals, and I could go into many, many more of them, no one has yet been thrown in jail. That's... yeah, I mean, I'll just leave it at that. Basically, with all of this, the message that Ukraine is sending to the world is this. We're sort of like Russia, we're sort of corrupt like Russia, but we're not quite as bad. You know, in Russia, they kill their political opposition outright. In Ukraine, we arrest them and we keep them in prison without trial for a year and a half and then only begrudgingly let them out on bail. You know, in Russia, they allow their corrupt officials to blatantly get away with their corruption. In Ukraine, we also allow them to blatantly get away with their corruption unless there is a sufficiently large public outcry, in which case we fire them from their post, but we don't actually punish them. We don't actually, bring any kind of serious criminal charges against them. We don't put them in jail. We don't effectively really do anything. So in Ukraine, when the defense minister is implicated in a major corruption scandal, essentially mulcting the armed forces, mulcting soldiers out of funds and forcing them to procure equipment at inflated prices so that he and his cronies can essentially funnel more money to themselves, when that happens, this corrupt official, this horrendous thief, this traitor, this infamous prick, he's not punished in any serious way. He's simply relieved of his post, and then he's allowed to go on vacation to Spain. So that's the message that Ukraine is sending to the world. Basically, we're kind of like Russia, but not quite as bad. And that's not good enough. That is not good enough. If Ukraine wants to come out of this war in one piece, and if Ukraine wants to have any kind of future worth having, it needs to do much better than that. There need to be radical reforms enacted. And so far, there's little to no prospect of that happening, even under the pressure of war, because the Ukrainian administration is treasonous, because the officials in the parliament and in the highest reaches of the presidential administration do not want to win the war. I should briefly discuss, by the way, two members of Zelensky's presidential administration, the real powers behind the throne. On the one hand, you have Andriy Yermak, who before being involved in Zelensky's presidential administration was a corrupt television industry lawyer. And then you have Oleg Tatarov, who currently sits in Zelensky's interior ministry and who used to sit in the interior ministry of President Viktor Yanukovych. Now, what the hell, you may ask, is a cabinet member of the Yanukovych administration doing in a post-Maidan Ukrainian presidential administration? A very good question. This is a man, after all, who during the Maidan protesters arrested and jailed protesters, and yet he has a major position of influence in a post-Maidan presidential administration. And this should give you some flavor of what sort of government the Zelensky government is. Corrupt, cronyistic, pro-Russian. That's just the state of affairs that we see. So yeah, without major reforms, there isn't going to be a damn thing. There isn't going to be any future worth having in that country. Now, the final piece of news I want to cover, and this is maybe the worst piece of news, the saddest, the most depressing, the most horrible, is that on Friday, July 19th, so a week ago, prior to the recording of this video, a major Ukrainian intellectual, philologist, and nationalist, Irina Farion, was assassinated. Irina Farion was a major campaigner for the Ukrainian language, and she has a rather sizable YouTube channel, and had made many videos and many lectures on the Ukrainian language. She worked tirelessly to influence as many people as she possibly could, including government officials, to give up the Russian language and move away from it, and really to make Ukraine Ukrainian, because she understood perfectly well that for as long as there exists any significant presence of the Russian language within Ukraine, the Russian government, the Russian special services, the FSB, and so forth will always have a button that they can push, a lever that they can use to exert influence upon the Ukrainian government. And really the most serious internal problem in Ukraine today is that its political class is predominantly Russian-speaking. Politicians in Ukraine are forced by law to speak Ukrainian when they appear in public and when they act in their official capacity. But when these people return to their private lives, they are all Russian speakers. And therefore, they have connections to Russia, they consume Russian media, they know Russians, they engage with Russian culture, and that simply makes it easier for the Russian government to influence them, which is why we have this miserable state of affairs where all or at least substantial chunks of the Ukrainian parliament and the presidential administration and so on are basically on the take for Russia. This is the root of the problem. Farion, who for quite a few Ukrainians and quite a few people outside of Ukraine who don't know any better, has been accused of being a radical. She had ruffled quite a few feathers and rankled quite a few people because she tended to be rather outspoken in her views. But really, she only got into trouble in Ukraine because she had an annoying tendency to call things by their proper names. She understood the very obvious fact that unless and until Ukrainians were able to decolonize their own minds, to decouple themselves from Russian culture, until they were able to do that, they could never have any realistic hope for there being peace in their country, because Russia would always endeavor to invade them, endeavor to conquer them, and the pro-Russian elements within Ukrainian society, and especially within the Ukrainian government, would work behind the scenes to demilitarize Ukraine and to make any such efforts on the part of the Russian government as easy to bring to fruition as possible. This threat would always exist unless and until Ukrainians finally took their own side, began learning their own history, began learning about what Russians had done to them, began adopting their own language, moving away from the Russian language, and essentially severing whatever cultural links still existed. If you are not able to decolonize your own mind, then liberating pieces of Ukrainian territory from the Russian Empire will ultimately be of very little significance. Because even if the Ukrainians are able to liberate this territory, even if they are able to push the Russians back, in 10 or 15 years, some other imperialist will rise to power in Russia. And don't worry, there are millions of such people there. So there's no shortage of them. So it's useless to hope that this will not happen. Of course it will happen, because the entire Russian identity at this point is constructed around imperialism. If you force them in one way or another to give up their pretensions and their efforts to reconstitute the Russian Empire, there isn't going to be much remaining of Russian culture at this point. So there will always be this threat until Ukrainians finally learn to take their own side. And it is only in doing that that they will come together as a nation, that they will promote their native cultural institutions, and that they will arm themselves properly in response to any possible threat of invasion from Russia. Only in this way can Ukraine really be safe. And until they do this, whatever else they do in attempting to counteract Russia, whatever victories they achieve on the battlefield, will only have temporary significance. Farion knew this. It was perfectly obvious, really. There was nothing especially radical about her, in my view. But many people were rankled by her. Many people found her annoying because, frankly, they're too lazy to pick up a dictionary and learn their own language. They want to stick to Russian. But yeah, I mean, as long as this kakaya raznica nonsense continues to persist in Ukraine, there will be no prospect of anything decent ever emerging there. I should also mention, with respect to Farion, that a few months ago she got into some trouble because she had criticized the Russian-speaking members of the Azov battalion, essentially saying, how can you really say that you're a Ukrainian if you are speaking the language of the occupier, if you are speaking the language of the imperialist, the colonizer, the invader? Because if you are doing this, then you are, to that extent at least, surrendering yourself to him. And so your resistance to him, even on the battlefield, can really only ever be partial under those circumstances. She got into enormous trouble for saying this. People began excoriating her. But again, really, if you're serious about this, if you're serious about protecting Ukraine from Russian aggression and keeping it from becoming a Russian satellite state or a Russian colony, you ultimately will have to adopt views like Farion's. There's no alternative to this. And any person who understands the situation truly knows this to be true. Now, after Farion's death, her funeral was live streamed in quite a few places. I watched it, and there were enormous numbers of people who attended, thousands. So I hope that she exerts more influence in death than she ever did in life, and I hope Ukrainians really start taking her advice and listening to her, because if they don't, they're not going to have much of a future, frankly. Finally, I should say that it appears that the assassin, the man who shot her, was caught. Allegedly, the alleged assassin is 18-year-old Vyacheslav Zinchenko. There's some speculation to the effect that he may have been involved in various Russian neo-Nazi groups, although that's not clear yet. This information is just coming out now as I speak. It's very fresh, and more information is bound to come out. We're bound to get more details and learn more things, so I can't really say much on this topic at present. But if anyone's interested about whatever happens to come out about this assassination in the future, let me know, and I might provide more information in the comments or in other places. But yeah, the assassination of Irina Farion, a horrible thing, just awful. And I hope Ukrainians start waking up in larger numbers and listening to her, because she was obviously and inarguably right. So, with all this having been said, what do I think it will mean for Ukraine if Trump should become president? Well, a lot of Ukrainians have been freaking out over this because really, I mean, this is another embarrassing aspect of Ukrainian political commentary. Almost no one has been able to move beyond just guzzling down regime propaganda and believing all the nonsense to the effect that Trump will betray Ukraine, that Trump wants to tear NATO apart, that he wants to surrender it to Putin. None of this will happen. Ukrainians have been freaking out over Trump's choice of J.D. Vance as his VP because Vance has made certain comments to the effect that he doesn't care what happens in Ukraine and that Ukraine is corrupt. So let me address all of these things right now. Let me say in no uncertain terms, if you support Ukraine but you have Trump derangement syndrome, get a grip, okay? Get a grip. Ukraine is going to be fine. No matter who wins the election, whether it's Trump or Harris, Ukraine is going to get weapons. However, if Trump wins, Ukraine is going to get many more weapons. And I'll explain in a moment why I think that's so. There's been a lot of speculation going on in Ukrainian media about what Trump's peace plan for Ukraine is likely to be, because Trump has, on a number of occasions, come out now and he's made the usual he's said the usual bromides, and frankly they are just bromides, to the effect that if he had been president, no war would have happened, and so forth and so on. Putin would have never invaded. Now, in fairness to Trump, that's probably true. However, the invasion has happened. There is a war, and given that there is now a war, that has to be dealt with. And Trump has refused to provide any specifics on this. In fact, the only time when he was directly asked a question on this topic and provided a direct answer was during his debate with Biden, when he was asked whether he found Putin's demands for territorial concession from Ukraine, namely that he wanted the Kherson, Zaporizhia, Donetsk, and Luhansk oblasts and Crimea as a condition for any peace plan, that is, Putin did. And Trump was asked directly whether he found these conditions acceptable, and he flat out just said that no, he didn't. That is the only time I know of where Trump has provided anything resembling a direct answer. Now, frankly, I don't think Trump has any sort of plan in place. However, there are members of his administration, influential members, not J.D. Vance, who is a nobody, who owes his political career entirely to Trump. Need I remind you that a few short years ago, just as recently as 2016, J.D. Vance was the toast of the town in left-wing circles. He had written Hillbilly Elegy. He was being interviewed everywhere. And at that time, he referred to Trump as Hitler, as cultural heroin, as all these, ridiculous and absurd epithets. Now, he says now that after having met Trump and conversed with him and seen what his first presidential administration was like, he says that he's been persuaded and that he now recants of all those things that he said formerly. And, it's difficult to know how sincere this is. Is there some element of opportunism in this? Yes, probably. It's possible that Vance has changed his mind, but any reasonable observer should hold on to and cannot be expected to let go of any suspicions to the effect that there's opportunism driving this, and that Vance simply knows which side his bread is buttered on. So what I expect will be the case with Vance, to put it very simply, is this. Vance was chosen to be Trump's VP, especially in the wake of the attempt on his life, because Vance is a loyal dog who will do and say whatever Trump tells him to do and say. And so that means that just as Vance claims that his mind was changed on Trump, so his mind will be changed on Ukraine when Trump begins inevitably to express support for Ukraine. He will do whatever Trump tells him to do. If Trump tells him we need to support Ukraine, he'll support Ukraine. And this is how I know that Trump will support Ukraine. Now, I operate here on a very simple principle. All governments are oligarchical. All of them. Absolutely all of them. Genuine democracy is a fiction because even in ostensibly democratic forms of government, there are going to be some people who display either a talent or a willingness to engage in political issues more intensively than the average mass of people. And so inevitably, as a result of this, an elite will form, and that will be a de facto oligarchy in whatever government happens to arise.
Monarchy is also impossible because even a king needs an entourage of soldiers, if for no other reason than to collect taxes and keep the subject population in line. So, really, whatever nominal forms governments may be said to take, all governments are in truth oligarchical. And knowing this, if one wishes to accurately predict the character of a possible future administration, of a possible future government, one must examine the character of the oligarchy that is to comprise that administration. So, who are Trump's cabinet picks in his possible future administration? Well, I'll give you two examples. As Commerce Secretary, Trump has chosen Jamie Dimon, CEO of JP Morgan Chase. And as his Treasury Secretary, he has chosen Larry Fink, who is the CEO of BlackRock. By the way, the Trump would-be assassin appeared in a BlackRock ad. What the hell is that all about? Just bizarre. But anyway, so we've got the CEO of JP Morgan Chase and the CEO of BlackRock being offered important positions in Trump's administration. You know what that means? That means Ukraine is going to get weapons. So, to everybody with Trump derangement syndrome who thinks that Trump is going to surrender Ukraine, I have one simple thing to say to you. Relax, get a grip, stop paying attention to the dancing monkeys in front of the camera. Political rhetoric means nothing. The only thing that matters is who actually ends up occupying the key positions in the presidential administration. You don't listen to what politicians say when they run for office and they make their campaign promises. You don't listen to these things. The rule in American politics is this. When you run for the primary in your party, you say one thing. Then when you run in the general election, you say a second thing. And when you finally come to power, you do a third thing. And none of these three things need have any necessary connection to any of the others. That's just how it's been. That's been the truth with regard to every presidential administration pretty much in American history. It's been true with regard to Trump's first presidential administration, and his second presidential administration, should he come to have one, will not be an exception to this. So get a grip, relax. If Trump becomes president, Ukraine is still going to get weapons. Now, with regard to the specifics of Trump's likely plan for Ukraine, well, there have been two ideas bandied about. The first was bandied about by Boris Johnson and was described in an article that he published recently in the Daily Mail. I don't know whether I should really go into this in any detail because, frankly, although it sounds superficially reasonable, it's actually ultimately delusional, because what Johnson proposes is that Ukraine be given enough weapons to essentially restore the borders as they existed prior to Russia's invasion in February of 2022, and then all remaining territory, which had been under Russian control before then, be surrendered to Russia, and that the remainder of Ukraine be allowed to join both the EU and NATO. At which point the war would end and the rest of Ukraine would not be under any threat from Russian aggression. Now, the reason I find, and then in addition to that, Johnson proposes that Ukrainian troops, who by this point are battle-hardened and experienced, would then replace American NATO soldiers in NATO bases and would guard Europe, thus allowing America to save money on some of its military expenses. Again, this sounds superficially reasonable, but it's ultimately delusional. And the reason why it's delusional, and the reason why no peace plan will ever ultimately work with Putin, no matter what Trump proposes to him, is because Trump fundamentally is unable to offer Putin anything that he truly wants. What Putin wants is the reconstitution of the Russian Empire. Trump cannot give him this, even if we assume that the most lurid and absurd and ridiculous and evidence-free left-wing propaganda about Trump is true, and that he really wants to capitulate to Putin. He will not be able to give him what he wants. Even if Putin is given certain pieces of Ukraine, if that comes at the cost of allowing Ukraine to be admitted into NATO, thereby essentially surrendering any possible pretensions to any other part of Ukraine, that effectively means that the Russian Empire will not be reestablished. Putin is not going to accept that. He's not going to go for that. He has no incentive to accept such a plan. And so I predict that if Trump comes to Putin with such a proposal, Putin will essentially just tell Trump to go fuck himself, which, if anything, will provoke Trump into sending more aid to Ukraine and making it easier for the Ukrainians to achieve total victory. Now, as I say, I don't think the Johnson plan really deserves much in the way of discussion, especially since Mike Pompeo has recently published an article in the Wall Street Journal where he describes a much more likely Trump peace proposal. And Pompeo is worth paying attention because Pompeo was Trump's Secretary of State and CIA director at various times, and and pretty much everyone has said that Trump and Pompeo really like each other and they get along. Also, I should point out that during the RNC, when it came time for Pompeo to speak, he did devote part of his speech to talking about Russian war crimes in Ukraine and about the children's hospital that the Russians bombed a few weeks ago. So Pompeo is on board with helping Ukraine, and his article outlined a 7-point peace plan. And the peace plan is basically this. Point 1 is to achieve American energy independence. This is crucial because America has an enormous number of oil and natural gas resources, which it is not tapping because leftists committed to environmentalism are not allowing these resources to be tapped. Now, if they were tapped and if the United States could flood the market with them, specifically the European market, the price of Russian oil would fall even further than it has already fallen. And then Putin's coffers would dry up much more quickly. So leftist environmentalists who don't want to drill for oil or don't want to do fracking or anything like this, you have Ukrainian blood on your hands. And good for Pompeo for proposing this. This is a great idea. Point 2 is point 2 in his plan is to promote a greater alliance and greater ties between Saudi Arabia and Israel. I know. I'm not going to go further into that. I know what the problems are with that. Let's move on to the next thing. Point 3 is to point 3 is to tighten sanctions on Russia. Because as he points out in his article, there are many ridiculous and absurd loopholes in the sanctions that have been imposed on Russia. One particularly absurd such loophole is that Russian banks may do business with European and other Western banks if the transactions involved pertain to any kind of energy infrastructure. And of course, energy is the primary source of revenue for the Russian government, so this basically leaves the Russian government's primary means of funding its war machine essentially unaffected by sanctions, which is absurd and ridiculous. Things like this need to be tightened up, and it will be easier to tighten them up and easier to deal with the consequences of tightening them up if the United States is allowed to produce more of its own energy and export it to Europe and other countries. The effect on the market of crushing the Russian oil industry will be not nearly as severe. So then point 4 is to fire up the American military-industrial complex and get American factories producing more weapons. This is obvious. This is an obvious element of any serious peace plan. And besides, most of these factories are located in the Rust Belt and the Midwest, and the people working at these jobs producing artillery shells for the Ukrainian army would mostly be Trump supporters anyway, so Trump would just be giving jobs to his own people. It's obviously in his interest to do this. Point 5 would be to strengthen NATO. That is, to force the members of NATO who are not paying their agreed-upon share, the 2% of GDP that should be devoted to funding the NATO alliance. Point 5 is to force these people to play along, to stop freeloading. Now, some pro-Ukrainian YouTubers, particularly mainstream ones like Jake Bro, have absurdly and stupidly argued against this, and this is mind-boggling to me. Basically, the argument he's made is, well, if Trump objects to the behavior of other NATO members and to their continued freeloading by saying that he'll force them to pay more, well, that somehow secretly means that Trump plans to break NATO apart. I'm not sure how NATO is supposed to become weaker if more people are devoting more resources to funding it. But in any event, he another argument I've heard specifically from Jake Bro about this is that the statement that every member of NATO should devote at least 2% of its GDP to funding NATO is not a law, it's not a requirement, it's a guideline, and therefore Trump is wrong to attempt to twist the arms of NATO members to force them to pay their fair share. This is ridiculous. Look, there are all kinds of things that are not illegal, but which we do not for that reason say should be done. I mean, for example, like it's not illegal for me to go into my neighbor's house and just all of a sudden, unprovoked, call his wife a whore, you know? That it's also a social guideline that I shouldn't do that, but it doesn't mean that I should do that. And it doesn't mean that I shouldn't face consequences if I do choose to do that. So Trump's proposal here is perfectly reasonable. There's nothing wrong with it. Yeah, moving on. Point 6 is in Pompeo's plan that he outlines in his article is to admit Ukraine into NATO. And then point 7, and this is the most important thing by far in the short term, point 7 is to remove all restrictions on what kinds of American weapons Ukraine may use, and to remove all restrictions on where in Russia it may carry out strikes. Oh, and another thing that I forgot to mention, and this is especially important. Instead of passing new funding bills for Ukraine every year, Pompeo proposes instead to essentially give Ukraine Lend-Lease, which, by the way, it originally had. There was a Lend-Lease Act passed for Ukraine back in 2022 that expired, and Ukraine never took advantage of it. And it's an interesting question as to why that is. By the way, a brief aside on this topic. Back in February, on the 2-year anniversary of the Russian invasion, Ukrainians came together in Washington, D.C. to hold a protest and a rally in order to, express their will to give more funding to Ukraine and so forth. I was present at this event. And the most interesting thing that I was able to observe while I was there is the stark difference in attitudes between Ukrainian Americans, that is, basically Americans who just happen to be of Ukrainian heritage and who've lived their entire lives in the United States, who don't speak Ukrainian at all or who barely speak it, and who, if they do speak it with a noticeable American accent. And on the other hand, the actual Ukrainians who may live in the United States but who have only come there relatively recently, who know the language fluently, and so on. And the attitudes that these two respective groups have to the Zelensky government are night and day. In short, the Ukrainian Americans, the more Americanized Ukrainians, tend to believe the mainstream narrative about Zelensky, that he's this heroic Churchillian figure and so forth. The Ukrainians, on the other hand, all know that he's a traitor. They all know that he's a criminal. They all know that he's corrupt as all hell. They all know that he's deliberately protecting officials who are credibly accused of theft, who are credibly accused of stealing from the army, and that in so doing he is only making it easier for the Russian army to win because he is blocking essential reforms. So it was interesting to observe this. Now, at one point, while I was there, the Ukrainian ambassador to the United States, Oksana Makarova, who, by the way, her husband runs a Ukrainian-themed restaurant in Washington, D.C., and I promise you all that restaurant is the site of a major money laundering operation. But anyway, be that as it may, Makarova appeared to deliver a statement. And while I was standing there listening to this, there was a group of Ukrainian women not far from me who started chanting, Makarova de Lend-Lease. Makarova, where is Lend-Lease? Why isn't Ukraine getting Lend-Lease? And the reason that Ukraine wasn't getting Lend-Lease, despite the fact that Congress passed the Lend-Lease Act for Ukraine, is that the Ukrainian government didn't want it. Okay? They didn't want the United States to lend them weapons for two very simple reasons. One, what would be flooding into Ukraine under those conditions would be weapons, would be military equipment, and you can't put a tank into your bank account. So that's obviously inconvenient to the likes of Yermak and Tatarov and so on. Secondly, at least nominally, under the provisions of the Lend-Lease Act, Ukraine would eventually have to pay back all of the value for the military equipment it receives. It's essentially on loan, and of course, you can't steal something if you have to pay it back, right? So, the Ukrainian government itself blocked or refused, I would say, deliberately, openly refused. Like Yermak at one point actually said this in a meeting with American officials, that they don't need Lend-Lease, which is insanity. Insanity. Like, you see why I say that these people want to lose the war. But yeah, he actually said this, that Ukraine doesn't need Lend-Lease. And he said this because if Ukraine were funded and armed on the basis of a Lend-Lease program, this would make it more difficult for Ukrainian politicians to steal. But that also goes into Pompeo's plan. So you basically inundate Ukraine with weapons, you give them as much as they need, you remove all restrictions on them, and you allow them to flatten the Russian army. And this Pompeo proposal is probably the most credible thing that we have in regards to what Trump is likely to do with respect to Ukraine should he become president. So what I'll say in a word here is, because this video has already gone on for quite a while, and I actually planned to briefly discuss why I think those who care about the future of Western civilization should care about Ukraine. In a word, when I'll say this very briefly now. This is going to be a very cursory discussion. Don't treat this as my full statement on the matter. I might make a video about this later where I discuss this in more depth. But basically, when civilizations collapse, they tend to fall apart in their central areas, and then on the periphery of the geographical extent of that civilization, there tends to be a cross-pollination and interaction between that first civilization and other civilizations. And in that environment of cross-pollination and cultural exchange, there arises an openness to new ways of doing things. And that is important because civilizations decay and collapse because, and I'm borrowing this term from Carroll Quigley, what Quigley calls an instrument of expansion. That is to say, any social instrument within society whose purpose is to take that society's creative energy, whether in the production of art or useful inventions or scientific theories or philosophical ideas or what have you, to take society's creative energy and then find a way to take society's economic surplus and divert it in such a way that that new ideas continue to be developed, so that that society is enabled to continue expanding, and because it keeps getting an influx of new ideas, it's able to retain vitality and essentially function well, and to deal with problems, to prevent inertia, to overcome whatever issues it might have. However, over time, what tends to happen is that the elite that controls the instrument of expansion tends gradually to transform that instrument of expansion into what Quigley calls an institution. And he defines an institution as any organization whose primary purpose is self-perpetuation. That is, the organization may have served some genuinely socially useful ends, but now only exists to perpetuate itself. And when this happens, the elite then proceeds to take society's surplus and waste it on all kinds of unproductive spending. So that could be pyramids, massive imperial palaces, DEI initiatives, which is a favorite wasteful, source of wasteful, conspicuous consumption of our own elite today. They tend to waste it on things like this. And so the society becomes increasingly less able to deal with problems, increasingly rigid, increasingly less able to respond to a changing world, and therefore increasingly prone to collapse. This is important because Western civilization has all of the tendencies bringing about its decadence and pushing it forward that I've mentioned earlier. But Ukraine is on the periphery of Western civilization. That is, it has one foot in the West and one foot out of it. And so it occupies this sort of Goldilocks zone of cultural exchange, of ferment, of mixture, and it's exactly the sort of place where one would expect there to be the most willingness to accept new ideas, the most openness to new ideas, and therefore the most openness to Western ideas that have worked. Things like the importance of rule of law, property rights, and so forth. So if Ukraine is able to achieve total victory, if Ukraine is able to reform itself properly, and I expect, by the way, that if Trump comes to power, he will force the Ukrainians to do this. He will not be like Anthony Blinken or Joe Biden, where they'll make a few sheepish remarks about corruption but not push anything too hard because they don't want the embarrassment associated with that. No, Trump will not do that. Trump will go to Zelensky and Yermak and their whole entourage and basically say to them, look, I am going to take a very meticulous accounting of everything that I give you, and if there is even a dime missing from any of it, your balls will be in a vice. And that is what needs to be done, because that is the only way to force these people to behave. So for Ukraine's good, for Ukraine's own good, I genuinely hope Trump wins. But anyway, so Ukraine is in this ideal spot where it's got one foot in Western civilization and one foot out of it. And that's important. Because as I say, if you study the historical pattern of the rise and fall of civilizations, one pattern you see is that when one civilization collapses and another arises later on in the future to take its place, the capital of the subsequent civilization tends to be located somewhere on the periphery of the previous civilization that had collapsed. So, for example, when the civilization of Minoan Crete collapsed, its central area was obviously the island of Crete. The Aegean Islands were on the periphery, and yet after the collapse of the Minoan civilization, when classical civilization arose, the center of that civilization was the Aegean archipelago. Of course, also, as a civilization develops and as it goes through crises, it is possible. Quigley has a whole 7-stage model of civilizational development that I'm not going to go through here because, again, this video is already long enough. But in some cases, when errors and troubles build up in a civilization, it is sometimes possible for that civilization to either implement reforms or create a new instrument of expansion which circumvents the older instrument, which has now become an institution, thereby allowing that civilization, at least for a time, to revert back to an earlier stage of its development and therefore restore some of its lost vitality and continue its expansion. Again, I'll discuss all of this in more detail. But basically, if this happens, sometimes what you'll see is a pattern where an older civilization a civilization is able to revivify itself and continue and overcome a crisis. But when it overcomes this crisis, its previous central area, its previous capital, moves to what was previously a peripheral area. So the original center of classical civilization was, as I say, the Aegean archipelago, but then later came to be Rome, and Rome, Italy, that was on the periphery originally. Also, when the Roman Empire collapsed, France was on the periphery of the Roman Empire, and yet when Western civilization emerged, and I guess you can date the full-fledged beginning of Western civilization to about the year 800, more or less, when Charlemagne was coronated, France was on the periphery of classical civilization but became the first major capital of Western civilization. Then Western civilization's center moved around a bit to various major European cities, so from France to London and so forth, because Western civilization has shown a remarkable tendency to reform and reinvent itself and overcome crises. This was the case in the late Middle Ages. This was the case in the early modern period, when in the late Middle Ages the feudal and guild systems basically became ossified and sclerotic, and they essentially shut down all openings for further development. Happily, however, the merchant class was able to win in its kind of class struggle against the nobility, and so the West developed a new instrument of expansion. That's only one example of this kind of overcoming and reinvention. It's happened multiple times. But what I want to say is that the West has managed to move its center multiple times as it's overcome crises in its own history. And each time this has happened, the center has moved to what was previously a peripheral area. So Washington, D.C., the current capital, the current center of Western civilization, was once an area on the periphery, some colonial backwater. And it may be possible, in the fullness of time, after perhaps 50 or 100 years, that the center of Western civilization, should it manage to overcome the crisis that it now faces, might reemerge in a place like Ukraine. Not necessarily in Kiev. I mean, it could be in Warsaw, it could be in Tbilisi, but I think it's reasonable to predict that if Western civilization is able to overcome its current crisis, its new capital, its new center, its new core of its new revivified self will probably be somewhere in that area, because it's located in just the right spot for that sort of thing. This is by no means a sure thing. I mean, the Ukrainians might fail to implement sufficiently radical reforms. A million things could go wrong. I am merely bringing this up to say to you that if you care about the future of the West and you are aware of the trouble that it faces, you should be aware of the possibility also that it might be able to reinvent itself, and if it does, this will probably happen in a place like Ukraine. So, in closing, what I want to say then is this. If you are worried about the future of Western civilization, and you want to at least slow down its inevitable decline, and you are American, vote Trump. If you are aware that the current demographic issues in America will not be resolved, even if Trump manages to win, even if he manages to deport some illegals, but you still understand that when a future crack-up happens, when a future breakup happens, a Trump presidency now will at least marginally put the, proper, non-insane, non-progressive faction of that civil war or conflict into a better position than it might otherwise occupy. If you understand this, if you care about the future of Western civilization, vote Trump. And if you are aware of the possibility that the West may be able to, and in fact needs to, reinvent itself, and that its chances of reinventing itself should be maximized, vote Trump. And if you care about Ukraine and maximizing its ability to destroy the Russian Empire, which just in its own right should be destroyed because it's an awful, corrupt, brutish thing, then vote Trump. So yeah, basically that's all I've got to say about that. I hope Trump wins. I'm not especially confident in it because of, obvious reasons, but I predict that Trump will probably win, and I hope he does, and I hope that everyone within the reach of my voice who is able to do so will vote for him. And that's all I'd like to say. That's enough for now. Thank you for listening.